Beginning now. Welcome everyone to our Saturday morning deep dive. And I'm excited that we are working with Josh Douglas and focusing into how to take back our elections. And I'm picturing this, our taking back our elections between now and November is one part of it. And then perhaps looking bigger view, wider view, to now be between now and the presidential election in 2004. There's a lot of things we can do. And even to 2006, that's kind of as far, maybe it's telling on how long I'm gonna live, but I think I went out to 2006 to the midterm there.
2026.
Oh, 2026. Thank you.
I was gonna say, what are you talking about?
I get mixed up easily.
The years fly by.
So 220, 224, 226, kind of in that view.
Okay.
And Josh, would you share with us, as a lawyer coming up, how did you choose to become a real expert in election law and election reform?
Sure. So first, Richard, thanks for having me here this morning, and thanks to all of you for joining. So I went to college at George Washington University in DC. I grew up in Amherst, Massachusetts, in Western Mass, and kind of wanted to go to a bigger city, and was kind of a little bit interested in politics even as a young kid. And so I wanted to go to DC, and I majored in political science. And then I took 2 years off in between college and law school, and then went to law school. In my second year of law school, I took a course called Voting Rights Law. And I loved the course. It was with a professor named Spencer Overton. And Spencer really opened my eyes to how my new legal career, the legal education I was receiving, and voting rights and political science were melded together. I was recalling actually that I did run for treasurer in, I think it was, I need to figure out, ask someone. I think it was either 7th or 8th grade. I can't remember which one. And I remember it was a dispute. I lost, but it was a disputed election. They had to rerun the election because some people weren't able to vote or something. And so I actually wonder if that was really the catalyst way back when. I have to ask some friends from junior high whether if they recall this happening as well. But I remember that they didn't announce the results, but someone told me that I was going to win, but then some other guy's friends weren't able to vote or something. So they did a revote and I ended up losing. But anyways, it was really, besides that, it was law school where I took a voting rights class and saw how it melded my interest in political science with my interest in law. And then Spencer really took me under his wing and said, this is something that I think, if you're interested in it, you could be really good at being a scholar in. And so, I've been at the University of Kentucky now for 10 years, doing voting rights and election law.
And then did writing your book, Vote for Us, flow out of your teaching and research and in high interest?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the tool of the trade for law professors in their scholarship are what are called law review articles. They're kind of 50-page, 300-footnote scholarly discussions of particular issues. So, for example, I wrote an article about state constitutions and the right to vote, where I looked at every single state's constitution and looked at what it said about voting rights and made an argument that courts should better protect the right to vote under state constitutions because we can't rely on the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court. As part of that, I do a good number of op-eds as well. So I've written for numerous times for CNN.com, Washington Post, only once for the New York Times. I've always trying to get back in there. I had a piece in the Cincinnati Enquirer a month or two ago. So what I found in writing the op-eds is that I really enjoyed writing to the general public. And so the book is a sort of a long wind-up to say that the book is really a combination of my scholarly work in these law review articles and the op-eds I do, and writing something for the general public in a longer form, because I really enjoyed that kind of work. And there's a lot of scholarly work that goes into the book, but I hope, and people told me, that it's really accessible for a lay audience, which was really the goal.
Very, and I loved your stories and the language, how you frame things throughout the book, and it feels personable, or in a personal level as well as on a systems or rules level. And one of the words, the democracy movement, was a word that you used in the book, and reforming democracy from the ground up. Now, of course, that touches our hearts because we're a on the ground activist group, and Bold New Democracy is our title. And so is that your frame about democracy movement, or is that bigger than your own use of that term?
So it's interesting you bring up that term, because I actually fought with my editors with the publisher about capitalizing that or not.
Yeah.
They didn't want it capitalized because their style guide says something like that isn't capitalized. And I insisted that democracy movement have a capital D and a capital M to demonstrate that this is a real movement. I've seen that phrase occasionally in other places, but so I don't know if it's something that I came up with on my own or saw from somewhere else. But I did want to make it a focus of the book, and how, this needs to be a democracy movement, and importantly, not just a movement to fight against voter suppression, but a movement to create ways to make it easier, more inclusive, more convenient, and then hopefully to improve turnout. So to me, the democracy movement is a lot more than what I think we see a lot of activists doing, and very, very important work, don't get me wrong, on combating voter suppression, but actually going on the offense as opposed to just playing defense.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment, because that is one of the key questions. Are we more attacking systems that are unfair, if I understand your point there, Josh, or are we creating new ways of handling things? So there are comments from the group about that, the two approaches of opposing or creating, keeping it real simple, new ways.
So let me share this slide here. If you all see this. This is a slide I use sometimes when I do my book talks, which I think demonstrates what we typically do, right? It's playing whack-a-mole, because what we do is we fight back against one effort to suppress the vote, to rig the system, and then another one pops up in its place. And so I'm certainly curious to hear from the group, but my view is that that work needs to continue, that's really important, but it's just not enough. And we're always going to be treading water if we're just focused on the latest horror that one side or the other is trying to impose on voters.
Yeah, Susan.
I agree. We cannot stay in a binary system. I mean, we have to do it from as many different angles as we can possibly think of. So.
Mm-hmm. Other comments or your thoughts about this? Yes, Antoinette.
Well, this is a new concept for me, and because I'm used to a long history since the 1960s, late 50s, so most of my life, of people opposing wrongs. And so now to think of taking a different approach, a creative approach, I would like a few more examples of what we would actually do, or how we should actually approach it.
Sure. So I have lots. I mean, the entire book is examples of, and so for those of you who have not read the book or not seen a summary of it, let me provide a little summary. So what the book does is it looks at, as we already talked about, I've heard a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
Yes, somebody's.
Can people
Mute everybody.
too much background?
All right. So
Thank you.
Everyone can hear me, hopefully. So what the book does is it looks at what I call positive voting rights reforms. So I have a suite of ideas of democracy reforms to make it easier, more inclusive, more convenient to vote, ultimately to improve turnout. And I'll skip to sort of an end slide here just to show you what the ultimate goal here is. which is, it's not that exciting of a slide, but why not 90% turnout?
Yeah.
Why not go for something compared to this? If Did Not Vote had been a candidate in the 2016 presidential election, they would have won a humongous landslide. So these are all the states with turnout that was below 50%.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Mhm.
And then in the 2018 midterms, turnout was about 50% nationwide, and people were celebrating. People thought it was an amazing thing because it was a record of, it was a record for decades of high turnout. And I thought to myself, why are we celebrating when half the eligible electorate didn't show up, right? That's not something to celebrate. Yeah, yes, it's good because people are more engaged than before, but that's not something to celebrate. So Antoinette asked for specific examples of how we fixed that. Well, what I did was I looked at the states that have higher turnout, that are doing things, I think, in a better way. And I looked to see what kinds of reforms they have implemented, what kinds of different voting changes. And then I dived deeper to say, okay, how did those things come about? Who were the people behind it? What was the catalyst for these democracy movements? And I identified people who I refer to in the book as democracy champions, who are the ones who were really focused on this. So some examples. In your own backyard in northern Kentucky, I opened the book with a story of a guy named West Powell. And I'll tell that story very briefly because I think it's a really good story to demonstrate the power of people's advocacy, people's words. So about 25 years ago, when West was 18 years old, he made a dumb mistake. He broke into an auto salvage yard and stole a car radio with his brother. He was caught. He was convicted of a felony. He got probation at first, but then he violated the terms of his probation because he was working a third shift, and or maybe the second shift, but he didn't get home till 11 p.m. from work, and his curfew was 10 p.m. His probation officer caught him, and so he ended up going to jail for about 11 months. He got out as a young guy, and he basically said, what am I doing? This is not who I am. This is not who I was raised to be. I'm not a crook. So he cleaned up his life. He had a hard time getting a job because he had to check the box saying he was a felon. So he created his own company, a computer repair shop. He met a woman and got married. He had 5 kids, 4 girls and a boy. He always said that he wanted a boy, but the 4 girls came first. What do you mean? But he told me, so I interviewed all these people, by the way, that are in the book. And he told me, look, I still didn't feel like I was a full part of my society, full part of my community. And the reason is because Kentucky at the time, and still under the law, disenfranchises former felons for life. 25 years later, the Kentucky legislature, conservative, was considering, and how sort of had considered for many years, a bill to allow some lower level felons to get an expungement of their records, to wipe it clean, which would do a number of things, including give them the right to vote back. And West went to testify before the committee that was considering the bill. And he told his story. He spoke for about 2.5 minutes, very soft-spoken, kind of like a teddy bear of a guy with a very soft voice. He said, I'm West Powell, and I made a dumb mistake 25 years ago. He said, I think I paid for that mistake 4 times over. What more do you want me to do to be to be just like you, part of society? Well, in the hearing room that day was a guy named Whitney Westerfield, pro-law enforcement, conservative Republican, and run for attorney general. And he said he was opposed to felony expungement. He said nothing would change his mind. But then he listened to West Powell's story. And he just said something clicked for him. He said, I finally put a face to the problem. I could hear the emotion. I could hear, this guy's right. What else could could society expect him to do? And so Whitney said, I'm going to do this. And he started texting his fellow Republicans and said, we got to get this done. This is the right thing to do. And why is it the right thing to do? Because someone like West Powell just convinced him. And they did get it done. And so Kentucky passed a law to allow some low-level felons to get an expungement of their records. Now, it wasn't perfect, and what the governor did a couple months ago in an executive order to just let all felons vote is way better. But what did one person do? The power of one person, the power of West Powell telling his story led to an expansion of the electorate. And my favorite part of West's story is that he did get his right to vote back. He got his felony expunged, and he hasn't missed an election since.
Yeah.
So Antoinette, you asked, what are the possibilities? Now we can talk about expanded vote by mail, something I talked about in the book that was published almost a year ago, a little over a year ago now, which is now in the forefront of these discussions. Automatic voter registration, ranked choice voting, which Cincinnati used to have decades ago, actually. Making it easier for voters with disabilities to participate. Doing things like independent redistricting commissions at the local level, campaign finance reform at the local level, which can lead to further expansions, improving civics education, lowering the voting age to 16 for local elections. And actually there's a young gentleman in Cincinnati who's taken on that cause and I think has made some good progress. And in fact, there's going to be a vote in November in Yellow Springs, Ohio, outside of Dayton, on lowering the voting age to 16 for local elections there. So there's lots of stuff we can talk about, but they're all driven by groups like yours and by everyday Americans who are starting to tell their stories and then lead to other people expanding and taking the cause.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Other comments about this whack-a-mole? I like that, where we're just attacking things, kind of reacting. And another approach is to make it become advocates and create change, create support for it, or even initiate change. Who else would like to, it's not an either or here either. It's kind of where we put our focus as an activist group and strategize for this year and upcoming years. Who else would like to share?
I'd like to see what Josh has got on those slides.
Well, we've kind of gone out of order, so I'll give you some more of them when the topics come up.
Yeah. And Josh, I want to honor Josh here too, that he has this whole program, but part of my approach, as you know, is to make it more participative rather than marching through. I'm sure.
And I prefer that as well.
Oh, good. Thank you. Who is next?
Well, then I have a question. In considering the sort of positive things, which one do you think would garner more voting rights than the others?
It's a great question. It's a question I've thought about a lot. And there's sort of different answers depending on what our time horizon is, I think. Mm-hmm. One reform that I don't talk about in the book that I actually have come around to support, but a lot of people in America wouldn't. I think we have a lot of work is just mandatory. Some people don't like the word, but mandatory voting, like Australia has, or universal voting. I mean, that would be great, right? Everyone would vote. I think the strongest democracy is when everyone participates. As long as you have I don't want any of the bums option. You have to have a none of the above. And I'm actually on a working group that's going to be putting out a report. We were going to put it out this spring, and then the coronavirus hit, but a group through the Brookings Institute that is considering what we're referring to as a universal voting. So that's sort of like the big picture, but I'm not sure that I think it's a good idea in concept, and I think maybe we could convince some localities to try it out, but I think that's a very long-term strategy. In terms of what we know works in the short term, so that's the longest term. I guess I'll go the medium. I'll go the medium term, and then I'll go to the shortest term. The medium term one that I think actually has the biggest promise is lowering the voting age to 16 for local elections. And here's why. And this is one that a lot of people, including those on the left, object to sort of as a visceral thought. And then once they hear the arguments, this is an issue that actually changes minds. A good example of this is Brattleboro, Vermont, very, very liberal place, had a ballot initiative to lower the voting age in local elections there in 2015, I believe it was, and it lost about 2-1. And they put it on the ballot again 4 years later and did some advocacy and educated people, and it won about 2-1. I mean, it flipped, and it got about 2/3 of the vote. Now, it can't go into force in Vermont until the legislature approves it. So the legal landscape is a little bit different. But Ohio, actually, cities do have the power of what's called home rule. So you could pass local specific voting rules. So why 16? Well, one thing we know about voting is that voting is habit forming, that one of the biggest predictors of whether you're going to vote is if you voted previously. We also know that if you skip the first election when you're an eligible voter, you're much less likely to become a habitual voter. Wow. So the key is, how do we get people to vote in the first time they're eligible to get them into the system? And 18 is a terrible time to do this in people's lives, by and large. They're moving away from home, typically. They're going to college or entering the workforce. Maybe they're using their prior home address still for voter registration, which means they have to jump through the hoops of absentee balloting, which is not easy for a lot of people. They've got so many things going on in their lives. Also, they're just dispersed everywhere, so it's not like we can easily make sure that everyone gets registered ahead of time and educated properly. 16, however, is an interesting age in which to start this practice because you're in the supportive environment of your home and your school. We can develop meaningful, strong civics education. I have a whole chapter in the book about civics education because I think it's so important. I did a lot of, I'm not a psychologist, but I read a lot of studies of brain cognition because that's the number one objection is you hear about, oh, you know, these dumb kids who are going to eat Tide Pods, although I guess our president thinks that's how we can clear the coronavirus as well. But you hear, you know, the stupid kid mentality. What psychologists say is that, and this is somewhat simplified, but essentially there's two kinds of cognition, what they've broken into, what they call hot cognition and cold cognition. And hot cognition is impulse control, peer pressure, doing stupid things. And psychologists say brains aren't developed for that until age 21, maybe not even 24 or 25. But cold cognition is slower thought processes, reasoned decision-making, not peer pressure in the moment of the decision. And psychologists say the brains are developed for cold cognition by age 16. And what we see in the cities that have done this, so Tacoma Park, Maryland, Hyattsville, Maryland, Berkeley, California for school board elections, although it's being implemented, I think, for the first time in 2020. But the places that have done this, we see turnout among 16 and 17-year-olds is about double that of 18 to 29-year-olds. So it seems to be working. Now, what we don't yet know, and it's really hard to track, is whether it's true that these voters then become habitual voters, because it's hard to track because then they disperse. And so I don't know where the 16 to 17-year-olds in Tacoma Park have gone to be able to see if they've become habitual voters or not. And it's something I'd like to study. But we see that the turnout, at least among these groups, is really high, and school districts are also becoming on board. So if we're talking about getting to that 90% turnout aspiration, the medium term, if we can create a whole new generation of engaged young citizens who will then become habitual voters, I think we could have a major transformation in our turnout and then in our politics. And then the shorter term, I think we're seeing it right now. You know, the states that do this best have a combination of short registration deadlines, either, you know, very short or same day registration where you can show up to the polls and register and vote at the same time, and vote by mail. So that, you know, states like Colorado and Utah, which has vote by mail, so it's not a Republican or a Democratic thing. Washington, Oregon, all have a combination of automatic voter registration or same day registration, as well as universal vote by mail. And I like the system that they're doing out west, where everyone automatically receives a ballot without even asking for it. So it's not like absentee balloting where you have to ask for them to send you the ballot. And what we see is the turnout is the highest in those states. And it makes perfect sense, right? Because if we make it easier for people to participate, then they're going to be able to vote. So the book tells the stories of the individuals who came up with these ideas and got them passed. The other one is vote centers. Instead of having to go to your home-based precinct, if you want to have in-person voting, being able to go to any vote center in the county. Which again makes a lot of sense. Is the guy who came up with the idea, Republican county clerk in Colorado, told me, he said, you know, I can go to any supermarket I pass and get basically the same thing. Why can't that be the same case with voting? So the shorter term, universal vote by mail and registration reform. Medium term, lowering the voting age to 16, at least for local elections first. And then longer term, you know, if we could get a movement towards universal voting, I'd be supportive of it.
Josh,
What happens if you don't vote in the universal?
So in Australia, it's a small fine. I think it's like equivalent to $25. And there's a whole bunch of reasons you can essentially get out of your fine if you have a list one of the various excuses. So there's a good list of reasons to say, here's why I didn't show up. And again, you don't need to vote for someone. You just need to, it really should be called universal showing up. Or universal turnout as opposed to universal voting, because you're not required to vote for any particular person. And the studies I've seen from Australia show that a very, very small percentage of even those who are fined end up paying the fine, because there's appeals processes and there's, boxes you can check. And turnout in Australia is usually around 90%, maybe a little bit higher. But yeah, typically a small fine.
Thank you. Josh, since we just went through our primary election, and one of the things that's really was a challenge for us was the application process in order to get a vote by mail. And so that became a big hurdle in itself, and getting, with the people's required to stay at home and all that. It was just a big challenge, and maybe stupid from the beginning. Do you think, what's your advice if we were going to try to advocate to the Secretary of State and to the legislature? Is there enough time, in your view, to advocate for a different system rather than the application to get a ballot in Ohio?
So the first thing I'll say is that you actually have a pretty good Secretary of State. Frank LaRose is pro-voter. He's done a lot of good things that kind of buck his political party, I think. And although I don't agree with everything he's done, I think you all have someone that is doing a relatively good job and is open to these kinds of conversations, which is not the case in lots of places. In terms of how to do the process, so I advocated for here in Kentucky as well to have the state mail every voter a ballot. And the Secretary of State here, Michael Adams, who is also someone who I think, is, as a Republican, is doing a good job and is generally speaking open to ideas, notwithstanding his support of a strict photo ID law, which passed. He basically said mailing every voter a ballot, universal vote by mail, was a non-starter because of what he believes is bloated voter registration rolls. And basically he said, 10% of the voter rolls are inaccurate, and he didn't want actual ballots floating out there. I don't know what the state of the voter registration rolls are in Ohio, although you all did just pass automatic voter registration, I believe, right? Or some sort of registration reform.
No, I don't think so. I mean, not at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. We don't have that. There's been talk about it, but as far as I know, nothing has been passed about automatic voter registration.
I thought there was some. What did you all voted on a ballot proposition last year to make some changes?
Yes, that was around gerrymandering.
Oh, that was the redistricting, independent redistricting. That's right. Okay. So the question is going to be really, what does LaRose think about the voter rolls, and to what extent does he believe the voter rolls are bloated such that he's uncomfortable sending absentee ballots to every voter? What Kentucky's doing, actually, which I think is great, and there's two reasons that I think is actually a good move, is they're creating a new online portal specifically for people to be able to request absentee ballots. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And the two reasons it's doing it, one is the voter roll issue of not sending every voter a ballot. The other, which I hadn't thought of, and it changed my mind on why actually I ended up supporting this plan, was that if you mail every voter a ballot, or actually, so let me back up. I then, after like he rejected mailing every voter the ballot, I recommended mailing every voter a ballot request form, right? And just automatically mailing every voter an absentee ballot request form. And that was rejected. And so the reason that was rejected, I think makes sense, was one, doing this online portal, is a good idea. And two, county clerks are not used to processing thousands upon thousands of paper applications. Yeah. And so the online portal minimizes the work of the county clerk's offices because our elections are really decentralized. And that to me was very persuasive. So I still would prefer mailing every voter a ballot.
Right.
And I think the Secretary of State here's concern about bloated voter rolls is misplaced. But since that was a non-starter for him, I think doing the online portal in which they're creating right now, I think makes a whole lot of sense.
Would that be more achievable too, Josh? Pardon me. Would that be more achievable? Because sending a ballot out seems like there's a lot of stories, but the fact that it would be less expensive, it would take that burden off, I mean, maybe online, I mean, you could request online or email or whatever, and maybe by phone, because not everybody has computer.
Yeah, this
That
doesn't
would be
take
how you
away
get it.
from the prior ways to request an absentee ballot. It's an additional way. The other thing the state is doing, and the costs are not terrible, is mailing every voter an informational postcard, and that's actually a lot cheaper than mailing them the absentee ballot request form.
Oh yeah.
And the
You know-
postcard has the URL, will have the URL, basically explain, here's how the process works, and it'll have the URL.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
but-
those, I think, yeah, again, that's achievable as well. So an online, they got to start soon, but an online portal plus an informational postcard is certainly achievable by November.
Yeah.
You know, in
Goodness.
Ohio, they sent the postcards out, and I spoke to lots and lots and lots of voters prior to the primary. And a lot of people do not have a computer, or they don't have a printer, or they couldn't get to a mailbox, and they needed somebody to help them to mail it for them. So I love the idea of automatically sending these people a form. And I understand it's a lot of paper, and maybe we need to look at what is the medium to do this. But just, my heart broke. For people to get an absentee ballot, the cutoff for us was April 25th to request one, and then they had to be in 2 days later. And the day between that was Sunday, where there's no, it didn't matter. So, online portal, even for some, the elderly, and I have to say, on my list, I spoke to a lot of 80 and 90-year-old people, a lot. And God bless the ones that knew how to work the computer, but a laptop. But those people, I think, are being left out.
Oh, absolutely, right. And the issue is that there's really no perfect solution that you're going to get everyone on board with. Again, I would like to just mail every voter a ballot.
Right.
But you have to. What I've seen, and I've learned a lot over the past 6 months working with the Republican Secretary of State here, is that if you're willing to come to the table in a spirit of compromise and willing to give a little bit, then you can get a lot more. So, for example, one thing I don't like about the Kentucky plan, but I think it's a compromise worth making, is for all of those postcards, so it's not going to be non-forwardable, and any of them that get bounced back to the state as undelivered, that will be the first in a multi-step process to then take voters off the voter rolls. I don't like taking voters off the voter rolls, but that's what I saw having to get the deal that we got, which was to create this online portal and to mail every, and all the things that I think are really great. And the Republican Party, the Republicans in here in Kentucky are very upset at the Secretary of State. They think he sold them out essentially, and he's getting kind of funny. He's getting more praise from the Democrats and but his response is, well, look, here's what I got for our side, which is we can start cleaning up the voter rolls by using this postcard. Now, the postcard itself can't be used to purge someone from the vote rolls. It's the first step in a several-step process. But Christine, I hear what you're saying. There's no perfect solution. People are being left out. The question is, what can we get agreement on? What can we pay for? And what can we get done in the crunched amount of time that we have to prepare for the election?
Should we not start with even just voter registration? There's so many people on the list where we spoke to, like you said, prime example, the 18-year-old that went to college, and I'm talking to her mother and father, and she's not even there yet. And there's a part of me that says, even if it's the Democratic Party, just get out change of address and telephone numbers and emails. I think the database sucks in a lot of ways, that you're starting out, like maybe they shouldn't be on, to take them off the voter registration right away. Do we need to update something in our record? Phone number one, you know what I mean? Or they move somewhere else, and it's just get that updated. And I feel like we need to go back one step, in my humble opinion.
Well, I think automatic voter
Updated.
registration does a lot of that work, because what it does is it essentially lets the DMV database and the voter registration database talk to each
That's
other,
perfect.
because people are much more likely to update their driver's license.
Right.
And technically, when under federal law, when you do that, you're supposed to be asked about voter registration, but the reality is that this doesn't happen.
Exactly. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Josh, based on this. The informational postcard, I really like to make it informational rather than another whole step in there. Can postcards be forwarded? So if somebody moves the mail, the post office will forward that? Because I've heard in Ohio anyway, that it does not have the forwarding capacity, or they refuse to do that, or something weird in there.
So I don't know what the possibility is in terms of the Postal Service. This deal between the governor and the Secretary of State made that postcard non-forwardable. Because for the very reason of giving the Republican base something to say, okay, we can use this if we get the information back that this was undelivered. Now, again, what is the process for the voter purge? The state would then send another notice in July for a person to fill out. If that gets returned as undeliverable, and then the person doesn't vote in 2 subsequent federal elections, as well as not updating the information, then they can get taken off the voter roll. So it would be basically a second postcard in July, and then not voting in November 2020 and November 2022. At that point, the state would then take the person off the voter rolls. Again, I don't love that, but I'm willing to have that as a compromise in exchange for much more lenient, vote by mail with no excuse absentee balloting, et cetera. You just got to come to the table with things, as opposed to, and this is one, I guess, a criticism not of your group, but just of a lot of groups in general, is I feel like they dig in sometimes and are very idealistic about what they want, that they're unwilling to give to the other side, and what you see is an impasse. And it's just one person's view, but I've been fortunate to be in the so-called room where it happens, is that you get a lot more by giving a little bit.
Yeah. The length of time for registration is the key here also. We have 30 days before the election is a registration cutoff. In your view, what's your advice? Is that worth advocating to change that, to make it shorter? I mean,
Absolutely.
I don't, even in this year, Josh.
Well, if you get the legislature behind it, right? So, I mean, what you see is the states, and the studies show the states with the longest registration deadlines, like Ohio and like Kentucky, have the lowest turnout. Now, Ohio's a little different because it's a swing state in presidential election years, but still, if you map out the states with the highest turnout, the states that have same-day registration or shorter registration deadlines have higher turnout. And the good news is, I haven't talked to Frank LaRose about this myself, but I sense that he would be in favor of shortening the registration deadline, because he does want higher turnout. And he's got this great little bet going with the Michigan Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, a Democrat, about which states can have higher turnout in 2020.
Yeah.
So, I think appealing to his sensibilities in terms of higher turnout. Now, again, would I go for same-day registration? Probably not. But would I seek to cut it down to 14 days? Yeah.
14 days. Cool.
And you can look and compare that to other states that have that. There was a pro-voter bill that was going through the Kentucky legislature, which unfortunately the coronavirus stalled, that the Secretary of State was behind, but it was going to lower the registration deadline from 29 to 21 days.
Mm-hmm.
I was advocating for 14, but this is something that's interesting. The Secretary of State, I think was in agreement, or at least understood why to go lower. The county clerks here were very much against shortening that time period, because they're the ones that have to process the registration forms. And the county clerks, I don't know how it is in Ohio, but the county clerks in Kentucky are very powerful and have a lot of say. And because they're the ones on the ground having to do the work. And so they were making the argument that, like, look, if you shorten the registration deadline, that's going to give us much less time to prepare our poll books for election day. So that's sort of the hurdles to figure out, how can you get past, even if you get LaRose on board, which you might, is there a movement among county clerks to stop something like that?
Thank you. Yeah. Who has something to ask?
I have a question about why you're opposed to same-day registration.
Oh, I'm not opposed. I think it's great. I think
I thought
going
for 2 weeks.
No, well, I think that you're not going to get movement. I think if you try to go for same-day registration, you're going to get nowhere because the logistics of that, of implementing that, especially this quickly for November, my guess is it's going to be a non-starter. So I am very much in support of same-day voter registration. I don't think strategically you're going to get that in Ohio for November 2020. Will you get that for November 2024? Maybe. Go for it. I think absolutely. The studies are all 100% behind it. I'm just saying, what do I think you can get done for this November? I'm skeptical that that is strategy-wise. I don't know if you're going to get there.
Is there anything else that people would want to? Is there anything else that people would want to ask about the 2020 strategy? Well, we can do this, change the system this year.
Well, Richard, David, Benz, and Constance have had their hands up. So,
sure.
David.
Yeah. So, Josh. So, one of the ways that I think conservatives win is that they start with philosophy a lot of times rather than issues, and then they use that to push on all the issues. So by that I mean they'll start with something like free markets will make your life better, and then they use these ideas to push on every issue. And I see democracy as kind of one of those things, like democracy pushes on every issue. And a lot of times that's what I'll talk about, like why it's important to other folks. I'm just curious. So what's your pitch on why democracy?
So, and the other flavor of your question, I think, is why do I want higher turnout, right? Why is higher turnout a good idea and a good thing for our democracy? And I go back to first principles. The Declaration of Independence talks about the consent of the governed, right? We seceded from the crown and from England and wanted to create a new nation so that we would have the consent of the governed as opposed to being told what to do by the king. So that is a foundational principle of the founding fathers, right? This, in the words consent of the governed, is part of the Declaration of Independence. And philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, when studying America in the, I guess it was the early 1800s, focused on that concept of the consent of the governed as the key difference to why America could thrive as a democracy. And when you have, the slide of did not won 40-something states because turnout was lower than 50%, I'm not sure you can say you have the true consent of the governed. And that infuses everything that we're talking about and more. We haven't talked very much about structural issues in our elections, like gerrymandering, like big money, the influence of big money in politics, like the plurality winner system, what we call first past the post, as opposed to a system like ranked choice voting. All of these go contrary to the consent, the idea of the consent of the governed, and that's why I focus on democracy or democratic, small d democratic norms. And I've criticized very strongly Mitch McConnell for being anti-democratic, anti-democracy. And why is it important? Because to me, voter turnout of under 50% or just above 50%, normally in the presidential election years, we have 60%. I can't say, and we haven't talked about the Electoral College, not something we can change anytime soon, but none of these produce a system in which we actually have the true consent of the governed. And if we don't have the consent of the governed, then how is our system and how is our democracy, how are elected leaders legitimate? And so when they pass laws about environment or business or taxes or anything, how can we say that's legitimate if we're sending them to Washington, D.C., and we're sending them to our state capitals, and yet we can't be sure that they're reflective of the actual popular will.
Okay. Constance. And to unmute.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm doing. My question, I wasn't a question, or maybe just a statement that I agree. This is way back. That I agree. I think everybody should just automatically get a ballot. Period. And so what if the postage is wasted? At least it's in their hands, and I think they're more likely to just go ahead and mail it.
Yeah,
and their postage is paid.
The concern is not wasting postage. The concern is this myth of voter fraud, that the fear is, and again, I think it's mostly an unfounded fear, but the fear is if you have 10% of ballots floating out there without getting to their actual recipient, then there could be more fraud in the system. And unfortunately, there are anecdotes that people can point to. Right now, some Republicans sort of ironically are pointing to the 2018 congressional election in North Carolina, which was thrown out because of absentee balloting fraud. Now, it was done by Republican operative, why that election had to get thrown out. But, there's not a lot of voter fraud in the system, but where it occurs, what we've seen is it's a very, very small number, but where it has occurred, it's been through absentee balloting. And so the concern is that if you have extra absentee ballots or mail-in ballots floating around, then the likelihood, the possibility, or the concern of voter fraud is higher. Now, again, 5 states do this already. 5 states automatically mail every voter ballot, including Utah, a Republican state, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, and California is not. It's not every county, but it's almost every county. And there is not massive voter fraud in these states. They've upped the felony punishment for it. They hire forensic experts in handwriting to be able to do signature matches. So I don't know how to match someone's signature and see if the one on file is the same, but there are people who do this, forensic experts. So the reality is there's not, but the talking point is that there is, and so that's why people are resistant to mail out ballots to everyone if the voter rolls are not accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was on a phone call last night with friends from Nevada and Utah, and I asked them how they got votes, and they said, all you had to do was ask for the ballot. You didn't have to do the 2-step that Ohio did. And I was talking about that's kind of part of voter suppression. And the guy from Utah said, well, we've got this. And once we went to the vote by mail, the percentage of voters went up. And I pointed out that there aren't a lot of minorities in Utah that would normally vote Democratic. So the Republicans there don't have to worry about, a turnout that's going to hurt them.
Yeah, but we see all 5 of those states had higher turnout once they adopted universal vote by mail and actually just mail everyone the ballot. Yeah.
What factor does voter ID play in turnout, Josh? And in reading your book, I was excited to learn more about, and then went online, about an organization called Vote Riders. Is it a big factor? And would an organization, if we worked in partnership with them, it might be a way to make a difference here in Southwest Ohio?
So it's really hard to study the actual effect of turnout, of photo ID laws on turnout. Now, the first thing they say is that photo ID laws come in all shapes and sizes. They come in different flavors. Some, like Wisconsin, North Carolina, that got struck down. Texas have some of the strictest laws in the nation. And when I say strict, basically, it limits the number of things you can use as a photo ID. I was fortunate to be very involved in the debate over new photo ID requirements in Kentucky. And I don't support it at all. I wish it didn't pass, but I knew it was going to pass. And so I was able to get a whole bunch of stuff in the bill to make it a much more reasonable bill. A lot more things count. So, voter ID requirements in Ohio, I see. You all actually have a fairly broad list as well, right? The driver's licenses can be unexpired, so that's good. Utility bill. So Ohio's is not a strict photo ID law because you don't need to show a photo ID. You just have to show a voter ID, something, right? Bank statement, government check, paycheck, etc. That flavor of a photo ID bill, I should say voter ID bill, the studies show does not have a huge effect on voter turnout because almost everyone can comply with this kind of a law. I mean, there's just very few people that are not going to have either a photo ID, driver's license, or a utility bill, or paycheck, or basically something with their name and address is really what you're looking at here. Now, the stricter the law, the more likely it will have an effect on turnout. And the other thing to say is that all laws like these have an effect on particular communities more than others. So minorities, older people, students, all have a harder time complying with laws. But again, reading what you put up on the screen here, this law is what I would call a very mild form of voter ID,
Oh, good.
as opposed to a strict photo ID law. Now, that said, anyone that is impeded from the ballot box for no good reason, and there is no good reason for a photo ID requirement because it only roots out one kind of voter fraud, in-person impersonation, and that simply just does not happen. It just does not occur. One study looked at 12 years of elections nationwide, over 1 billion ballots cast, and found 31 possible instances of in-person impersonation. And of those 31, most of them were things like same name between a dad and a son with junior, and one person checking in by mistake for the other, essentially. So it just doesn't occur. But given that they exist, right? And so any voter that is impeded to the ballot box because of one of these is one voter too many. So what does Vote Riders do? And this is a great example of going on offense instead of playing defense. So playing defense would be to fight against this law, challenge it in court, try to get it struck down. Do what I did a lot in Kentucky, which was try to get a bunch of stuff in there to minimize the impact and make the law much more reasonable, which I think I was pretty successful by and large in doing. Going on offense is, all right, let's get on the ground and get people IDs. So what Vote Riders does is they go into states that have photo ID requirements and literally go to community centers and homeless shelters and farmers markets and anywhere they might find voters and say, do you have a proper ID that will comply for voting? And not only voting, but for all sorts of things. I didn't know this, but apparently a lot of food banks, if you're indigent, you go to a food bank, you can't get food without a photo ID. Some homeless shelters, they won't let you stay overnight unless you have a photo ID, which I had no idea. And so this helps people every day, not just for voting. So Vote Riders goes in. One thing they're doing right now, which is great. So a few states require a photocopy of your photo ID to go along with your absentee ballot. Well, if you don't have the ability to get a photocopy during the coronavirus pandemic, you can take a picture of your ID and email it to Vote Riders, and they'll mail you back a photo. They'll print it out and mail you back a copy of your ID, which you can then include with your ballot. There's another group called Spread the Vote, which I also profile, which is doing basically the same kind of thing. Spread the Vote is working, I think, more with minority communities, although Vote Riders is as well. Two great organizations that are basically resigned to the fact. I mean, there's still fight against photo ID laws, but they're here to stay. So they're accepting that fact and getting on the ground to get as many people IDs as possible. So Ohio's law that you put up there on the screen is not super concerning to me, but if there's even a single person who's impeded, then let's help get that person the documents they need to be able to vote.
What about education to people? What should I bring? Like our 18-year-old grandson voted for the first time, and he did not know what to bring, and he might go without anything, actually.
Yeah, so Vote Riders has wallet-sized cards they print for, I don't know if they're doing for every state, but you could contact them, and I can put you in touch with the executive director of their organization, a woman named Kathleen Unger. And they have wild-sized cards, which basically here are the photo ID requirements to vote in your state. So, I don't know if they have any for Ohio, or you could help work with her to create one if they don't already.
They said every state, when I looked it up online, Josh, they said every state they have, they'll send these cards to you. You tell them where you want to distribute the cards, and they'll send them free to us. So if we wanted to take that on as an action to let people know what they need to bring to vote, that would be a possible action to consider.
Yeah, and it's a great group. They're lean. They're working on the ground in communities all over, and so I support them all. I think it's a great example of. I tell a bunch of stories in the chapter about people on the ground in Wisconsin doing this. A former Miss Wisconsin who then became sort of enamored with this project, so it's a great group, and again, that's one aspect of Ohio law that's not as concerning to me as compared to like the registration deadline.
Yeah, Okay.
it's much more concerning in terms of the number of voters that are impeded.
Right.
But any small thing you can do is great.
Who's next? Question, comment, strategy, advice from Josh, Nikki.
This relates to getting kids to vote at 16. I remember probably when my son was like a toddler, but there was an elementary organization, and it was called Kids Vote, and it was done in the and it was a mock a presidential election, but it did sort of educate them at a young age, and even was said to have I guess made their parents feel guilty because they weren't voting. And I just wonder if that organization still exists, or, where it went.
I don't know.
I don't hear about it.
Yeah, I don't know about that organization. I will say that unfortunately, teachers are so there's so much pressure on teachers to meet their testing goals and meet the standards that civics education has really fallen. But there are things we can do from kindergarten all the way up. And one of the things that I advocate, both in the book and generally speaking, is what's referred to as action civics. So typically what we hear about civics, and you can do this, from kindergarten beyond, but typically what you hear is people learn about the procedures of government. They learn about checks and balances. They maybe watch the Schoolhouse Rock video of how a bill becomes a law. And frankly, that stuff is boring to most kids and most high schoolers. I mean, I think it's cool. I'm a constitutional and voting rights professor. But that's not the right way to engage students. Instead, what some teachers are doing, particularly within social studies classes, is what's called action civics, where they engage their students in their classes on real world problem solving. So I'll give a quick example from the book in DC, which is one of my favorites. So DC has a public school and a magnet school, and so it draws from all over the city. And the teacher there said to the class, let's talk about an issue that plagues your population and see if we can figure out a way to solve it. So they discussed and come up with brainstorm ideas, and they decided they want to tackle tardiness at the school. So they said, okay, why are students are persistently late? Let's figure out why and what we can do about it. So they did surveys among the student body, figured out that transportation was just not reliable for a lot of them. And so they came up with a plan. They went to the DC City Council, and they advocated to let students ride public transportation for free. And because of that, the DC City Council created what's called the Kids Ride Free Card, which was initially for buses, then expanded to the subway, initially for public school students, expanded to anyone under the age of, I think, 19 or 20 now. And it had a huge effect, and students weren't tardy as much anymore because they could rely on free public transportation. I mean, think about the impact of understanding how you can make a difference in your local community. Those students will never forget the importance of democratic engagement. And that's a great example of action civics. And there's some good organizations doing this work, but that, I mean, the mock elections are great. I think that's an important part of this. I agree that we should do that. But I think we can go much further beyond that, arm our teachers with the ability to engage in action civics projects. Sandra Day O'Connor has a great website called iCivics, which she started after she left the Supreme Court, that has a lot of great resources. So arming our teachers with the ability to do that, I think, has an even much stronger impact. And then coupling that with lowering the voting age, and now we've got a system that is unlike what we have currently.
Marie.
So my question is, sometimes kids, or when they get older, they go to vote because they see their parents voting. So how do you engage the 40 plus people who are completely disengaged with the society? How do you get that, generation to vote and therefore to engage their own kids to go to vote also?
So I think the direction is actually reversed. I think you get the 16 to 17-year-olds engaged, and because then that will in some way shame their parents and so what you do is you get into the schools, and we have to create a culture of trusting our teachers. We have to arm them with nonpartisan tools in an effort, and I talk about what happened in Scotland, and so Scotland lowered the voting age to 16. for its independence referendum in 2014. That was basically a one-party push, but then it was so successful that they lowered the voting age nationwide in 2015, moving forward from 2015 for all their elections. And they engaged their teachers through modern studies. And two things, the question I thought you were going to ask, which I get often, is, aren't kids just going to vote the way their parents tell them to? So aren't you just doubling the vote for their parents? And the answer basically is no. In Scotland, they did a study about this, and they showed that that 16, 17-year-olds, about 60% voted differently from their parents on independence. So I thought that was really interesting. But then also, the direction of education in Scotland also showed that kids were bringing home the discussions they were having in the classroom and talking to their parents, and that engaged parents more. So I think it's hard to get someone who's never voted, who's in their 40s or 50s, to start the process by targeting that group. It's not to say it's impossible, and political events can engage lots of people. We saw that in the 2018 midterms when we had a lot higher turnout by and large. But I think a medium-term strategy is actually to go to the high schools, and then that can have a directional impact on parents.
I like the story from Texas, I think, where the Secretary of State appointed the principals as deputy voter registrars, and it was kind of it probably got publicity and then all that. What was that, an accurate story, or how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think I found that one from a news article. Basically any principal could, because in Texas, the law, you can't actually register voters unless you're deemed to be a registrar. And so, typically county clerks. And so the Secretary of State basically allowed any principal to do it. Now, one reform, and I actually don't off the top of my head know Ohio's law about this, but we should certainly have at least pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds so that we can get them on the voter rolls, so that once they're 18, they're automatically registered already. And so that's something you can do in combination with, deputizing schools to allow for voter registration. You mentioned Texas, so I'll show my favorite picture that's in the book as well, because I just love this picture so much. And it is of a taco truck in Texas that also served as a voter registration spot. So this group called Mi Familia Vota, which is outreaches to Latino communities, was trying to think about what can we do to improve voter registration among our communities. And so they went to taco trucks in heavily Latino areas of Harris County, Houston, and brought them voter registration forms. And it was so popular that on the voter registration deadline, taco truck owners were calling the director, Carlos Duarte, and said, "Can you bring us more forms? We're running out." And he sent me this picture. This is an actual picture from one of their taco trucks that also was serving as a voter registration. So, getting innovative about how you reach communities that typically aren't as engaged. Oh, and by the way, turnout went up in these neighborhoods after it did. I can't prove causation because, there's lots of factors that lead to turnout, but I think it's a pretty good story about the possibility of doing something like that.
Yeah, good. Who's next?
I have a question. This is Laurel. I have a question. A couple of years ago, after the Parkland shootings, the teenagers were, especially the Parkland kids, they were very interested in voting, and they had a lot of organization going on. Is that group, what is the status of that? Is that still happening? And is that a way that we could tie in with some people who are just about coming into voting age? I mean, we have Moms Demand Action here in Cincinnati. Maybe if we tied in with them or somehow got through the kids. But I mean, what is the status of the Parkland kids' political activism?
Yeah, so the group is called March for Our Lives, and they're still active. They're still doing things. They have a broader focus, I think, than just on voting. They're working on school safety and gun rights, et cetera. So I don't know what their status of that they are in Cincinnati. The group that I've been working with that I think is really great on youth voter engagement in particular is called Generation Citizen, and their wing called Vote 16 USA. So I'm on the advisory board of Vote 16 USA, that they're working specifically to lower the voting age in various communities. And then again, they're part of a broader organization called Generation Citizen, which is all about engaging young people in democracy. And so, I think that they're a little bit more nimble, I think, than March for Our Lives. I don't know what March for Our Lives is actually doing right now. I know they're still in existence. I don't know what they're doing, but Vote 16 USA can go into communities and help advocacy efforts and et cetera. So, like I said, there's a young person in Cincinnati who contacted me. I think Richard, you may have contacted you as well.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, Yusuf Minur.
Yeah, and so I don't know if he's working with the Vote 16 people or not, but that's an organization I think is really, really key. And the other thing is, it is vital to have young people be the ones to be the primary advocates and have other groups supporting them. They're the ones that are actually the most persuasive in asking for their own voting rights. And so to help him, if he's still working on this, I think that your organization, in my view, the best bang for your buck would be to create infrastructure for him and what he's doing to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Who's next? Yes, Kath.
Yeah, this is just a personal question. Our granddaughter just turned 18 at the end of March, and because of the virus, she was able to vote in the primary, mailing in a ballot. And she goes, she's graduating high school, well, she guesses she is, and has had a very liberal education, very involved in politics. She wants to go on into city planning. She's very excited about women's issues, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Her father, who is our son-in-law, is extremely intelligent, keeps up on everything pretty much. And he hasn't voted in probably 20 years because he's very cynical. He doesn't believe his vote counts. He believes there's corruption everywhere, and can that kind of person be changed? And if so, how?
So again, I think the power of stories is really persuasive. And the story I'd like to tell for someone like that, or kind of two stories I like to tell for someone like that is, is just to recognize that, is your vote going to make a difference in the presidential election? Well, maybe in Ohio, maybe, but probably not, right? Statistically, one person's vote is not going to make the difference in the presidential election. But one person's vote will make the difference in local elections. And every election year, we have examples where a single vote changed the outcome in a local election. So why does that matter to someone like him? Well, because even if he thinks there's corruption in the system, even if he's cynical, he drives on the roads, he pays taxes, and he breathes the air. And all of those things are affected by who's in office. Even if he doesn't like either side, he surely is going to like one side slightly more than the other if there's a specific, and so figuring out what is the issue, not on the presidential national scale, but what's the issue that will make him understand that, okay, these things actually do have an effect, and that one vote might make a difference on who wins that local office. And then the other story is to say that, is to talk about Virginia. So Virginia had its state legislative elections in 2017, and the control of the entire Virginia legislature between the Democrats and Republicans came down to one election, one state district, and that district went sort of flip-flop, but was essentially decided by one vote. Initially, it was one vote in favor of the Democrat. Then after a recount, it was a tie, and they were going to re-vote, and then there were some challenges, and ultimately the Republican won by one vote. So the Virginia legislature was controlled by Republicans for 2 years, from 2017 and 2019, essentially because of one district and essentially because of one vote. Now, we can never know ahead of time which district that's going to be, but talk about the impact of one vote. And again, how does that play into his views? Well, whatever his issue is, whether it's taxes or driving on the roads or whatever, you want your pothole filled? You may or may not get it done based on whether you voted for one person versus another. And then, of course, the broader policies, women's rights, abortion, if he's like his daughter, concerned about women's rights, all of these things actually do make a difference on people's lives. I'm sorry, my cat is meowing crazily to come inside this room, so I'm going to pick you all up and open the door. I don't know if you can hear him, but he's bothering me. Now he's a lot happier.
Yes.
Well, welcome, Kitty. Oh.
He's a kid. We got him 2 weeks ago.
Ah, good. Everybody home getting a lot of attention. Who is a question or a strategy approach, or who has something to share? Susan.
I have another question to ask because I'm interested in voter registration, and the taco trucks I thought was interesting. Are there other places that you have heard of or can recommend to hang out?
That's the most interesting one, I think, because it's so unique. But yeah, I mean, of course, anywhere where voters are, I think, especially voters who are not touched by the system. I mean, I think that's the key, and that's what's most interesting about the taco trucks is when going to neighborhoods that are not typically touched by the political system, by candidates. Whether it's churches or religious institutions in inner city parts of Cincinnati, whether it's farmers markets, schools. I mean, schools are a huge place. Universities are really a key spot. But just being creative, supermarkets. But I think the taco trucks is the most unique.
Your advice for us about to put our energy, or what percentage, it's not an either or, into changing the system this year, for example, shortening the registration deadline or getting a much better system, for example, call in for your ballot or, online request for your ballot. That's one side. The other side is to work directly with citizens and more on the ground, person to person, rather than system versus person to person. What's your feeling about where to put, as an activist group, where to put our energies? What's your view of that question?
I think if you can get agreement on certain things like reducing the voter registration deadline, making it easier to request ballots, then that to me is sort of the preliminary structural piece that then allows you in September and October to go person to person. So I guess I would say, to me, it's not an either or in terms of percentage, it's a timing.
Yeah.
And so really, I think the next, the next several months up until, beginning of mid-September, the focus should be on some of these structural changes to see if you can make those impacts. And then in the 4 to 6 weeks leading up to Election Day, that's when you can get really on the ground focus. Because at that point, it's largely too late to make significant structural changes. So I would think of it as a graph in terms of the majority of your time focused on structural things now, and then as the summer goes on into the fall, that gets less as you focus on the person-to-person stuff.
That makes so much sense. And Steve, you have something to add. And you'll need to unmute. Laurel, you had something to share.
Yeah, I'm afraid that even in the 6 weeks leading up to the November election, we're still going to be doing social distancing. I just love doing the voter reg and the canvassing, but what can we do absent that in this time of social distancing to achieve the same effects that kind of activity did? I mean, what can we do to raise voter awareness, to get people to go to the polls? How can we do that when we're probably going to have to socially distance?
Yeah, it's really hard problem. I mean, in March in Kentucky, voter registration was down a tremendous amount. I mean, almost non-existent in terms of new registrants. So you got to be creative and innovative, right? So, op-eds in the local papers, I think, are key. Getting into the organizations that you already have contacts with, or maybe that you don't, and getting to use their email lists to send out information. Whether it's community groups, religious institutions, any place where you might touch voters where they are now on Zoom and social distancing, since you can't be, standing outside the supermarkets, at least, somewhat likely, then, at a minimum, still trying to touch voters. So I think things like a well-written op-ed, those sorts of things. It's hard. There's no great answers because of so much of what we do.
Supermarkets are open, and now maybe we don't have to start this tomorrow. Some time go by. Right. Do you think being outside supermarkets or in parking lots, we learned that that's a easy way, or asking the supermarket itself to pass out the registration forms? Do you think some voter engagement is going to be possible in places that are open anyway?
Probably. It won't be as much as robust, and there will be people who won't want to come up to a table, and have person to person, set a table 6 feet away from, just with the information 6 feet away from where you're standing. I think certainly that's possible.
Good. Steve, sorry I couldn't unmute you there, Steve.
No, it's all right. Thanks, Richard. Josh, I guess we've had some really good presentations about the whole idea of social media. And I'm curious if you have particular suggestions related. This group has really gotten some wonderful social media piece. And I think partially in answering the question that was asked here, how do you see social media coming into play here?
So the first thing I say is that we all actually have to be very careful about our use of social media so that we're not spreading disinformation, and to, before we hit that share button, verify the source, because it's a big concern. Social media can be a great tool for doing these things so long as it's done in a way that we ensure that we're not leading to the spread of misinformation. And, if something doesn't sound like it passes the smell test, maybe it doesn't. A good example, Donald Trump came to Lexington, Kentucky just before the November 2019 election for governor. He was here, I think, on the Monday before the election. And there's all this stuff, I got shared tons with me of this picture of what would look like someone dressed up as law enforcement with a scary looking dog. And the people were sharing, basically, I think it started like a local bookstore shared it first, basically said, look, the crazy Trump supporters are coming out and pretending to be law enforcement, because they weren't dressed like we normally see a police officer. Turns out it was Secret Service who was doing pre-checked, right? But and I had very smart, intelligent friends sharing this picture saying, look at this crazy Trump supporter trying to intimidate us from coming down and protesting here. So that example showed me that, like, even with some of my smartest friends, and when I saw it, I was like, well, let's dive deeper. Let's see first, right? And so we got to be very careful. But besides that, again, finding voters where they are. So, Facebook is a huge, still people use a ton, but young people don't use Facebook very much. Facebook has now become the spot for the older generations. Twitter is very widely used, as well as, Instagram is, and younger people in particular like Instagram a lot more. The other thing I'd say is, and this ties into my answer previously, is we have to invest in our local reporters and our local papers. I had the privilege of speaking to a lot of reporters. They are not biased. They're trying to tell the right story. Certainly the Fox News and the MSNBC report, they have their own skew. And, when we see these unfortunate video clips of the local TV that all, nationwide are all saying the same thing because their parent company is requiring them to say something. I think local newspapers are really the key to saving our democracy, and we have to invest in them. So I'm not sure if that's responsive to what you asked, but I want to make sure I put a pitch in to subscribe to your local paper, support it, because when they die, our democracy becomes one step closer to dying.
Right. Yeah. We have the Cincinnati Enquirers, our one daily, kind of more bigger, but of course being pressured so much economically and in other ways too. But then we also have City Beat, which is a pickup newspaper, which covers politics quite a bit, but they don't have the opportunity now to be picked up in all the different stores and around. And then
could your group engage with them in delivering to certain neighborhoods?
Yeah, we could, or certainly promote, because they have a nice online presence, and I think they can get their advertising dollars to keep them going from online people following City Beat. And then I subscribe to the Cincinnati Business Courier. Now, I'm not a typical business guy, but I find they handle politics and good things quite a bit as well. And one of the reporters came to one of our Bold New Democracy bigger events not long ago. So I think supporting Cincinnati Business Courier is another suggestion to support your point, to support newspapers, local newspapers. Who else has something? We're drawing down. Wow, we're really down to the last moments. And Josh has that raised bed project coming up here to build the raised.
Constance has her hand up, Richard.
Constance.
You were talking about like, what can we do to make our election law better? What activities can we do? And I'm thinking, well, maybe we should first know what we have for 2020. And, while, the dust is settling, votes are getting certified from the primary, maybe we can try to get an expert to come in for a Zoom meeting and tell us what it currently is, what they're planning for early vote, what they're planning for, how it is right now, and like what the potential is, or what's being discussed in the House right now, the Ohio House, for election law changes.
Great suggestion. What's your view on that? Bringing in somebody early that might be at the cutting edge.
Yeah, I might contact LaRose's office and see if they have someone that would be willing to chat with you all. I'm sure that they are evaluating how this all went. Certainly, they had the craziness of the back and forth of the elections on, elections off. So they're probably, going to spend the next couple of weeks after certifying the votes, evaluating and figuring out what they're going to do. So they may not have answers yet, but to schedule something for, in the summer may be worthwhile. And the other thing you all could do, by the way, is, I wrote an op-ed, I co-wrote an op-ed that called on newspapers to have what we call the democracy box on their front page, or for websites to have a democracy box that lists voter registration deadline with URL, vote by mail request deadline URL. And so, you all, that's something, another great thing you all could do is take the idea of a democracy box and try to operationalize it and implement it, on websites where you have, City Beat that you mentioned, the Enquirer, any sort of informational tool,
great,
easy to read thing that has, the various deadlines and whatnot.
Terrific. Last question or comment, Marty.
I was thinking maybe the League of Women Voters, we might make a connection with them. I bet we know someone with a relative in the league.
Yes, we do. Terrific. Josh, thank you so much. Your book is, we're going to keep working on that. What's the best way to follow you?
The best way to follow me is, since someone wanted more slides, I'll show you my final slide.
Oh, good.
My email, Joshua Douglas at UKY. I'm mostly on Twitter, Joshua A. Douglas. I don't post very much on Facebook on that Vote For Us page. So you can like it, but unfortunately, my activity there is not very much. So Twitter's really the best place to find me.
Okay.
And then there's my email as well.
Terrific.
And then if I can make a selfish pitch, that if you read the book and enjoy it and are willing to put up a review on Amazon, that definitely helps things. So
terrific.
If that's something you're interested in doing, I would certainly be grateful.
Oh yeah, we do need to do that. Yeah, everybody have that, and we have it that I'll put in some of the notes too for Josh's Twitter, particularly a good way to follow both the book and Josh as a leader in this field. Thank you, Josh, so much for giving your time here, and we will keep applying all these things to our work. Yay!
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Like I said, the book is focused on people like you, democracy champions on the ground. And then when Richard contacted me, this is why I wanted to do this event, because I think our democracy is best and needs to be fixed from the ground up, and you all are doing that important work. So I applaud you for that.
Yay. Thank you, Josh, very much. Enjoy, stay safe, and perhaps we're going to be continuing on with your leadership. Bye.
Bye now. Take care. Thank you all.